Still says going live. I'm live for 0 people in attendance. Good. Now, I've already explained what I want to do today, just briefly recapping. Number one, I want to run an experiment with you guys. And unfortunately, anybody who ends up joining us online won't be able to participate in said experiment. But I will show you exactly what I'm going to be doing with them when they're actually working on it. I'm going to run this experiment. We're going to talk about that. I'm going to get some notes done, and I want to finish up with a video in regards to some of the topics that we've been talking about. But we'll get there when we get there. First, the experiment. Okay, here's what you guys are going to do. In a moment, I am going to give each of you a strip of paper. On the strip of paper are letters. Both of you have the exact same letters on each strip of paper. You will be given 1 minute or so to memorize as best you can the letters on the strip of paper. When that minute is up, I'm going to ask for you to put the strip of paper underneath your desk so you cannot see it, and I will hand you a blank index card. Then you will start whenever you can. I will give you roughly 1 minute to write down in order as many of the letters as you can remember. When time is up, you're going to give yourself a score. That score will basically be like this. For every letter that you get correct in order, you get a point. So there's letter point, there's letter point, there's letter point. But the moment that you messed up, the moment that you made a mistake, that's it. No more points. Even if you made one mistake and the rest was perfect, sorry, no more points. That's the way it's going to be. So I have 2 strips of paper here. There has to be a little bit of randomization behind this, and we'll talk about the randomization that goes along with it. I'm going to randomize. I know, it kind of is, yeah. So I'm going to put these face down on your desk. Don't look at it yet. Remember, you're not writing anything right now. The first minute, you will just spend memorizing. And then when that time is up, put the strip underneath, and I will give you each an index card, and then you will write down as much as you can. Get ready, get set, go. Okay, strip of paper underneath your desk. Strip of paper underneath. You have 1 minute to write down on that note card as many letters as you can remember in order. Go. Okay, all right. So take the strip back out. Honor system. You give yourself a point for each letter, not combination of letters, but each letter that you got correct in order, you give yourself a point. The moment that you messed up, no more points. I'll take a. Oh, give yourself a score. Write the score on there.
3.
Whatever your total score was. That's it. I missed the first one.
I messed up one letter instead of a U.
Oh, okay. I got you. Yeah. Oh, I got you. Okay.
I remember a decent amount too.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Who won?
No, this wasn't a contest. This was an experiment. Now, I'll show you the results of this experiment in a moment, but I want to reiterate something. Up to this exact moment, would you agree that every single aspect of what each of you were doing was exactly the same?
Yeah.
You had the same amount of time, you had the same string of letters, as I said, you had the same strip of paper, same blue note card, same amount of time to write them down, scored yourself, everything was identical. You had the same amount of quiet, the same room, atmosphere, whatever. Everything was identical, except for one thing. No. You'll see in a moment. There was one thing that was a key difference between the two of you, and thus the manipulation. In an experiment, there is a level of manipulation that the person participating in said experiment is unaware of. And in some cases, you absolutely have to be unaware of it. It's called that you are blinded to the treatment. You have to be blinded to the treatment. Have you ever heard of people testing like drugs or testing pills to see if they can work to treat things? Where maybe you have 50 people and you give 25 of them the real pill to see if it works, but then the other 25 you give them a fake pill. It's called a placebo. That is a treatment, and that is a manipulation. Now, a manipulation is not necessarily a bad thing, but let's see what kind of manipulation I have with you guys. I'm going to write this on the board. There it is. You scored 3. You scored 21. Why was that? Now, no. You'll see. You'll see. Now, yesterday, here were some of the other scores that we got. Here are some of the other scores that we got yesterday. Now, I gave each of you a different treatment. You just didn't know it. The treatment that you got yesterday, someone scored a 30, and someone scored a 24. The treatment that you got yesterday, somebody scored 18, and somebody scored 11. Now, to be fair, he did have a ton of letters correct. It's just that he followed my rules, and he went up 1 letter, done, right? You did have a ton correct. No.
1 letter wrong.
Now, let me show you what the treatment was. I did not lie to you. You each had the exact same string of letters. You did. You had the exact same string of letters.
So what was different?
What's different is this. That's what was different. Nope. The dashes are in different places. The people who had the top strip of paper, on average, tended to score a lot better than the people who had the second strip of paper. Exactly.
Because you remember those 3 at a time.
And it was kind of like the name.
They made.
JFK, CIA, FBI, USA,
Yep.
That is pretty good.
That's what I'm saying.
That's how I did it.
That's what I did too, but it was kind of chopped up.
Yeah, yours.
Yeah.
It was terrible.
But that's what I'm saying though. Now the experiment in this case is talking about letter clusters and memorization techniques, and are people better able to memorize things if they're able to make words and phrases out of them or something like that? Or if you look at JFK, you immediately think, oh, President of the United States. CIA, FBI, yes, clearly governmental organizations. USA, SAT, GPA, GRE, near the end it gets a little tougher, Yeah.
Still good.
Yeah.
Still good.
Yeah. Just for the sake of argument, obviously you guys know what GPA is. Do you know what the GRE is? Okay. So you know how you take the SAT in order to meet certain college requirements for application? When you go to college, you go after your associate's or your bachelor's degree. After your bachelor's, the next level is your master's degree. In order to get into what they call graduate school, you have to take a test in order to get take the GRE of the subject that you're getting into. I did it a few years ago for mathematics, killed it. Wasn't able to continue. I didn't have enough time to take classes and teach at the same time. If I wanted to, I just didn't have time. I took a master's course, killed it, and then we had a kid. I'm like, ooh, I don't have time, But anyway, this was the experiment. Now, again, the idea of an experiment, something along the lines of all of these conditions are identical, but then there's one thing, a treatment, a manipulation that is being done to the factors of the experiment that, well, now I have a basis to compare. These people were given the top strip, and I can compare their average to the people who got the bottom strip. And I can clearly see a difference. And then from that experiment, I can analyze the results. An experiment's going to have a manipulation. Now, I go back to the people who smoke. Clearly, we can say smoking causes cancer. Back in the 1960s, they couldn't show that because they didn't have enough evidence to do it. They said, well, listen, you only have a correlation. You can't prove it until you've run an experiment or an observational study. Think about for a moment what an experiment would look like where I took a bunch of young people, like maybe 25 young people or 50 young people, split them in half, and I said to half the young people, you're this half, you smoke for the next 20 years. This half, you don't smoke for the next 20 years. And then after that, we'll compare and see who got lung cancer. What's wrong with that?
You want people to die?
What?
You want people to die?
No. Well, maybe. It's unethical. It's unethical.
Exactly.
It's unethical to do something like that. So back in the 1960s, you couldn't run an experiment because in an experiment, you have to control all of the factors. Exactly. So instead of an experiment, they had to run a long-term observational study where they looked at people and they looked at their medical records and they looked at their human behavior, based on smoking or not smoking over the long term. And then they were able to have enough evidence to say, look, smoking causes cancer. That's the idea behind experiments. I talked a little bit about the pill, the placebo thing. Placebo is mainly like a sugar pill or some junk like that, Yeah. But it's kind of like, I don't know which one would be considered the placebo. I don't think there would be in this particular instance. But I had treatment number 1 and treatment number 2. And again, it was the only thing that was different. Experiments can get really nutty. Experiments can get really interesting. Sometimes I had people last year conduct an experiment, and you probably remember it, where they brought out food and stuff like that. One group wanted to determine whether or not students had the ability to tell the difference between brand name and generic cereal, let's say. Or soda, exactly. And if you're going to conduct an experiment like that, you have to be able to, within reason, control the environment, control all outside factors, and make the experience identical for every person. And that's kind of what they did. And so what they did was, for example, not Lucky Charms, can't do that. Fruit Loops versus store brand.
Yeah.
Cool. So they would randomize which one you tasted first. You would rinse out your mouth or swallow some water in between. And then you would get the second one and you wouldn't know which one was which. And then you had to guess which one was which, basically from there. And then they were able to collect results based on how many people got it right, how many people got it wrong, whether they thought they could tell the difference between them, things of that nature. It was really interesting. I think it tastes better because it's cheaper. But that's just me. But it's just really interesting because it's more of a psychological thing. And a lot of these experiments come down to psychological things. For example, this. You saw this, and then in your mind, you're like, oh, this is easy. You saw this, and you're like, oh, crap. It's a psychological thing. Have you ever heard about the experiment of Pete? 1 second.
Teachers, please excuse the interruption at this time. Any juniors and seniors with correct paperwork and all their documents, and $5 can go to the
And $5.
process. Parking should not take that long. Thank you.
Okay. Anybody here doing that? No? Okay, cool. There's an experiment where they took like 50 college students to an abandoned prison back in like the 1970s.
Sounds fun.
I know. And they split them up 25 and 25. 25 of them, they said, you guys are going to act as the prisoners for the weekend. And the other 25, you're going to act as the guards for the weekend. Right? Now, there was a little bit of coaching in between, which might have ruined the results. But by the end of the weekend, mind you, they're all college kids. By the end of the weekend, the guards were like verbally and physically abusing the students who were pretending to be the prisoners in this experiment. It was nuts. Yeah.
Because that's what they were probably told to do.
Well, they were coached, but they were allowed to make their own decisions. And basically with the play acting, with the environment that they were in, with the authority that they held.
It's like watching other people do like the job themselves.
Pretty crazy. It's pretty crazy.
That is crazy.
Yeah. Now, they used to do all sorts of unethical things back in the day. They had this experiment back in the 50s. Now, you couldn't get away with this today. Maybe you could. I don't know. But they did this experiment where they brought somebody in a room and they sat them down at like a control panel.
One person.
Yeah. Brought them down at a control panel with a bunch of buttons. And they said, okay, and mind you, they told the person beforehand, like, if you're going to participate in this, we'll pay you this amount. And they're like, cool, I'll participate. Cool. So the person sits down at the control panel with all the buttons and they say, okay, now press number 5. Press number 5. Nothing happens. Nothing. Okay. Press number 3. Okay. Presses number 3. After he presses number 3, you can hear through the wall somebody screaming. And he's like, what was that? He's like, don't worry about that. Press number 4. Press number 4, nothing happens. All right, press number 7. Press number 7, screaming in the other room. Yeah. Now, mind you, the person screaming in the other room was an actor. They were acting. They were pretending to be tortured for the most part. But the experiment, and again, the person doing the experiment did not know why they were doing it. They did not know why they were pushing the buttons. They just told, as long as you participate, you'll be paid this amount of money. But the real experiment was, would they continue pushing these buttons even though they're making the connection, oh man, I'm actually causing someone that I don't know physical pain? 75% of the time, people continued pushing the buttons. Isn't that messed up? It's really messed up. Like, there are certain experiments that we really couldn't get away with anymore nowadays. They used to take babies, like newborn babies, and like a vat of water and like drop them in the water. You know what happened? Newborn babies would swim. Have you ever seen it?
No.
Hold on. Instincts. Yes. Hold on.
No, I did see. I saw a video like last summer. Some girl like just had her baby, just dropped it in the pool,
Yeah.
and it just came up, and it was just like sitting there like that. Like, so, you saw that? Yeah. Like,
Yeah. Okay.
it's crazy, right?
I didn't know that this was in color. I didn't realize this. Hold on a second.
No, there's some new stuff too.
Hold on.
Oh.
Look at the baby swimming.
Yo. That's so crazy.
I know that it's incredibly dangerous, mind you.
Oh, I would think so.
Yeah, it's incredibly dangerous. They can't really do these kinds of experiments anymore, though. I don't know what the heck that was. I have no idea where that came from. Maybe, I don't even know. But it's crazy with the way that these experiments work. It's really crazy. Now some of the more basic experiments, like, okay, I want to run an experiment to see what type of washing machine works better at cleaning clothes. Boring. But companies will pay statisticians to organize an experiment, a properly run experiment, in order to get the results that they're kind of hoping for. You know, so they'll take like the brand name Maytag and then some like generic name from like Home Depot or some junk like that, right? And they'll get like a bunch of identical T-shirts, and they'll take these identical T-shirts and maybe
Put them in mud or something.
exactly, maybe they'll do like different levels of mud or something like that, and then they'll like, okay, here are heavy, dirty. Put them in, wash them, see what happens. and then medium, put them in, light, put them in. And then in the end, they know which each shirt is, and they'll hang them all up, and they'll have like an independent person who doesn't know what level of dirtiness or which machine it was in, and come in and rate the shirts in terms of cleanliness. And then in the end, they'll be able to say, clearly, this machine cleaned better than this machine, or vice versa. Or maybe the results were inconclusive. I don't know. It depends. But being able to run that kind of experiment with identical conditions, but then there's only one manipulation, one factor that is changed between the two. And in this case, what I just explained, the manipulation was which machine the shirt was being washed in. Experiments are crazy. But again, people can run all the experiments that they want. You have to be careful with how you're going to present your data. You cannot let your own biases come into play. The video that I'm going to show you later after the notes talks about the severe manipulation of data and the manipulation of studies and experiments that are being done and at what people can get away with. It's insane. It's absolutely insane. I don't know. I don't know if you watch like the local news at all anymore. I don't know anybody who does, but there's this old stereotype on local news where it's like, coming up next, a new study shows, and then they go into all this other stuff. The new study shows. Those are the types of experiments and observational studies that I'm going to be talking about. Oh, it's going to be wonderful. Okay. If you would, very briefly, because like I said, I'm aiming to be done by 8:15, so I can have that video shown in its entirety. But if you would, I'm going to need those notebooks out and open.
There's still nobody on the lot.
There's one. Yeah, I'm still going to do it. Yeah. There's going to come a day. There's going to come a day where both of you are absent on the same day. Let's just say. There's going to be. Maybe. We'll see. Yeah, I don't know. I have no idea. But let's just say it happens. And no one will be on the live stream. I'm still going to teach. For funsies. Whatever. They're paying me to teach. Might as well teach. Let's see what we got here.
Being a practice teacher?
No, I don't know. Sometimes I think, are you guys all figments of my imagination?
It could be a simulation.
Yeah, you could be. Where's my marker? There it is. Okay. The title of this, I'm going to call it Bias/Experiments. I have to talk a little bit about bias. In order to get this thing moving. And then after the bias, we'll be able to get into the details of experiments and things of that nature. I've talked about these verbally, but I want to make sure that we have these concretely written down. So first of all, voluntary response bias. This is tricky. This is very tricky. When it comes to samples and surveys and polls, you really don't want people volunteering. Because if people are volunteering, you can't really institute a level of randomness. But if you're running an experiment, you can have volunteers. You can have volunteers as long as there is a level of randomness involved. I did use a level of randomness with you guys. I randomized the slips of paper. That's all I could do, whatever. Anyway, voluntary response bias is people who are invited to respond. Those, or I shouldn't say who, people are invited to respond. What did I write? Who? Those who do, there you go, are counted. I think I talked about this the other day again. I'll kind of bring this back up. Hey, Barnegat's going to be running a physical fitness test to see who or how physically fit people in Barnegat are. We're going to run this whole thing on a Saturday, and people are going to come out and run these physical fitness tests, and we're going to see who, how fit we are. I'm not going to show up for that. I don't want to. So the only people who are going to show up are people who are like already physically fit, people who want to show off, people who want to people who like doing it. Oh yeah, Barnegat's really fit.
No, just the people who show up.
Exactly. Whether it be a sample or an experiment, it doesn't matter. You're going to have voluntary response bias. See, voluntary response, basically, if you invite people to show up, is there a possibility that with what you're doing, you would only get people who would feel strongly in one direction. For example, a website decides, what's a weird website? I don't know, like Democrats.com or whatever, or Republicans.com. Doesn't matter. I don't care. But they put out a poll saying, who are you going to vote for? And then on the Democrat side, it's like 90% said they'd vote for Joe Biden. Look, he's got a 90% to 10% lead. Like that is, well, on the Republican side, to be, again, the same thing. It's voluntary response. That's why when you take polls and you do experiments, you have to try to eliminate bias. You have to eliminate bias. You have to try to. Convenience bias.
That would probably be the hardest thing to do.
Yes, it can be. It can be, unfortunately. That's why the methodology, the way that the data is collected, the way that the experiment is run, you have to do it in such a way where you're trying to eliminate this bias, but unfortunately, you won't be able to get rid of 100%. Convenience bias, those in the sample are convenient for us to sample. So I had students several years ago run an experiment for something. I forget exactly what it was because each kid was able to pick their own thing. And I know. One girl decided that she was going to sample everybody on the softball team that she played on. And in the end, I looked at her results and I'm like, I'm sorry that this experiment that you're running has a heavy level of convenience bias. And she's like, well, what do you mean? And I'm like, well, you sampled your entire softball team because you knew you were going to see them all. It's a random assortment of people. Yes. And the experiment had nothing to do with physical fitness, but it still falls prey to convenience bias. I'm not just going to sample the first, 20 people that walk out of Wawa. I'm just going to stand there and do that. And that's not, there's a certain level of convenience bias. The people on our softball team, they're all, teenage girls who may all share a certain opinion or have a certain ability, whatever it may be, whatever the experiment was. People walking out of Wawa at 2:00 in the afternoon, maybe they all fall into a certain category as well. There has to be a certain level of randomness behind this. Convenience bias. Let's talk about undercoverage.
You said undercoverage?
Undercoverage. Some portion of the population, I'm going to abbreviate the word population, is not sampled or underrepresented. Some portion of the population is not sampled or underrepresented. There's a story about an election that involved Franklin Delano Roosevelt. FDR was elected to the presidency 4 times. I know. After he was done being president, they made the law that you can only serve 2 terms. Yeah. Before that, everyone was just following George Washington's example. Yeah, because if you
until you get retired, right?
Yeah.
That's what you did.
think about it. The Supreme Court is a lifetime position. The Senate and the House of Representatives, you can get reelected for life if you get, not for life, but you have to keep getting reelected, but there's no term limits. But then all of a sudden they put term limits on the presidency, because there before FDR, there was no law. But my point is this. In 1940, I think it was 40 or 36. I can't remember. It was either 1940 or 1936. FDR was running against this guy called Alf Langdon. Alf Langdon. You ever hear of President Alf Langdon? No, heck no. But there was a poll done in this magazine. And the poll for this magazine was like, who's going to win the presidency? Who are you voting for? Kind of thing. And this magazine results came in, and it was overwhelming, 65-35. Alf Langdon. Alf Langdon's going to be the next president of the United States. Clearly, that didn't happen. The problem was this magazine was a very conservative-leaning magazine. And the readers of the magazine were all very conservative, right-leaning people. So when they put in their results for who they're going to vote for or who's going to win the presidency, for the magazine, I should say, it was overwhelmingly for Alf Langdon. Well, it's definitely convenience. It's definitely voluntary response. But more importantly, it's undercoverage in that sense. It could be more than one thing. Definitely more than one thing. Undercoverage, a portion of the population is not sampled. In this case, left-leaning people, Democrats. They weren't sampled, thus that the poll is completely null and void. You know? Yeah. Now, you were saying like it's also like convenience, and I mentioned voluntary response. Yes, there are times when you put together a sample and you can be like, it's this, and it's this. But sometimes it's like just this. For example, I do a random number generator to figure out phone numbers, and I call people. And I call people at 1 o'clock in the afternoon. 1 o'clock in the afternoon, I randomly call people's homes to ask them their opinion on something. Who was actually available and home to answer their phone at 1 o'clock in the afternoon?
Most likely
Unemployed, old people who are retired, stay-at-home parents.
or people who are just off.
Yeah, sick people,
Yeah.
or they have the day off or something like that. Now, I said not sampled or underrepresented. Basically, the working class, the people who work 9 to 5 jobs, are underrepresented. You might get some of them by accident, but you're not going to get a lot of them. And if you underrepresent a certain group of the population based on how you're collecting the sample, then I'm sorry, that's undercoverage bias. Yeah. It's all in the methodology. It is all in the methodology in order to avoid these types of biases. When do most polling companies call to get your opinion? When during the day? Dinner time. Because it's the largest proportion of people who are going to be home. Yeah. Now, obviously, in today's day and age, people are working all sorts of crazy hours. Some people just kind of skip dinner altogether or whatever. I don't know. Or they don't eat it exactly at the time they call, whatever. But if they call at dinner time, they have the highest chance of getting the most people. That's how they try to avoid undercoverage. Let's see. I got time. Go ahead.
And obviously there's still factors.
Of course, there's always going to be factors, and there's always going to be bias. Your job is to try to minimize it as best as possible. Minimize the bias, because you can't get rid of it altogether. I told you guys about Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Michigan, and the people who didn't respond to the survey.
Yeah.
Check this out. Non-response bias. Non-response bias is exactly what that was. Those who don't respond, because it's their choice. It's their choice to not respond. But those who don't respond have different answers to those that do. ,60% of the people who responded to that poll in Michigan said, yes, I am going to vote for Clinton. But then 80% of those who did not respond were going to vote for Trump. And as a result of that disparity, it swung the other way. Those who don't respond have differing opinions. Now, you can't eliminate non-response bias 100%. You can't, unfortunately. And it was a simple question. It was just a question of like, who are you going to vote for? And then their response was in their mind, well, I don't trust you. I'm not going to respond. Or I don't have time. I got to get to work or whatever. Those who don't respond have different opinions to those that do. There's a lot of different reasons why people would not respond to a particular survey. There's a lot of different reasons. Maybe they're offended by the question. I don't know. But then there's something else called response bias. Now, it's not the opposite. Response bias is not the opposite. Not. Let me ask you a question. Would you guys support a change to the Garden State Parkway that would raise the speed limit to 75 miles an hour? Cool. Let me rephrase the question. Would you agree to raising the speed limit on the Garden State Parkway to 75 miles an hour, even though it would cost more people their lives? You're not so quick to respond. You still said yeah, but you're not so quick to respond, right? Response bias is basically I word the question or the procedures or whatever. I word it in such a way where I'm trying to push you in a certain direction. I'm trying to push you to get a certain answer. Because if I ask that first question, yeah, of course, yeah, I'd get an overwhelming yes. But if I get that second question, I might still get yes, way less. Yeah. Way more people being like, maybe I don't want to agree to that. Anything in the survey design that influences the response, or parentheses, causes an emotional reaction. Causes an emotional reaction. Anything that kind of like has emotional kind of wordage to it or something along those lines. And people do this all the time to kind of mess with people when they ask them various questions. Like, again, I'm not getting into a political argument with what I'm about to say. I'm not getting into a political debate or anything along those lines. But people do this all the time with, like, for example, the border on Mexico, where they say, like, the question should be, hey, should we increase funding to Border Patrol agents? And then that's like a very basic kind of question right there. But then other people might word it in one direction or the other, where like one side might word it, hey, do you think that we should give more money to Border Patrol agents in order to keep out illegal immigrants that would be taking people's jobs otherwise and ruining our country? That would be one side. And then the other side is like, hey, do you think that we should be giving more money to Border Patrol agents even though they abuse their power and put kids in cages or something like that? If you word it in such a way, it could be the same question, but if you add all of this like extra information, you're kind of pushing people in one direction, or you're kind of going to really offend somebody with the way you worded it. That's why when you come up with a question for a survey, or you come up with a procedure for an experiment, it has to be a generic thing in such a way where you're not trying to influence somebody to answer in a certain direction. You have to keep it generic and plain and white bread or something like that. I don't know. Because the thing is, if you add in all this extra information, you're like, well, Mr. Markey, they needed to know that information. No, they didn't. Let them make up their mind for themselves. Exactly. I go back to the 75 mile an hour thing. I just said, hey, do you think the parkway should raise to 75 miles an hour? Basic question, no extra information. But I could also give you the question by showing you all of the statistics behind raising it 10 miles an hour and the number of people that would die, and showing you a picture of a car wreck or something like that, Yeah. Or make people angry, any type of, no, the emotions could be like sadness. The emotion could be anger. It could be anything, any type of emotional reaction. That's response bias. Your job is to try to eliminate that. Okay. Oh no, my paper. Good. I got 7 minutes and I just have a couple things left for you guys to write down, because I want to get to the thing by 8:15. Okay. Experiment example. No, just put experiments. I don't want to get rid of the word example. Experiments. Cool. Here's an example. Does music education cause good grades? What's your gut reaction?
Really good, not that.
Okay. People who are heavy into music education, or like play like all sorts of instruments, or play like on like bands, like county bands and state bands and stuff like that, do they tend to have better grades than other people?
Yeah.
Or is it the type of person where maybe their mentality is already geared to getting good grades, and then all of a sudden they're drawn to music?
That is kind of the most.
You know what I'm saying?
Really smarter kids will do it.
Yeah, like most of the kids that are not, it's not even just that. Most of the kids that are smart tend to play instruments. Or tend to be like in a band or something. You know what I mean?
It's kind of like chicken or the egg.
Yeah.
What caused the other? You know what I'm saying?
Literally.
But that's what I'm talking about here. Now, the thing is, you can't force kids to take music education. You can't be like, you take music for like the next 10 years, learn how to play the trumpet. I don't want to, kind of thing, like they did back in the day. What would be good in order to answer this question, you have to do something called an observational study.
Most of the time they didn't play the piano.
Exactly. But in an observational study is much different than an experiment. In an experiment, I kept talking about the manipulation of a factor, some type of manipulation, and it's an experiment. But in an observational study, there is no manipulation of factors. There's no manipulation of factors. In fact, the choices / results are just simply observed. They're just watched. I'll give you an example. There was a documentary. Somebody actually looked it up yesterday. It was a documentary. It's called 7 Up. And what they did was this guy in England on a certain day back in like the 1960s or whatever, he got in contact with a bunch of different families who just had kids. They just had a kid, like they were all born on a certain day in a certain hospital, let's say, in England. And let's just say there was 10 of them. I really don't know how many there were. But he interviews the parents, has footage of the kids, sees them kind of doing their own thing, kind of an introduction to the documentary. 7 years later, he gets back in contact with these families. And he interviews the kid now, who's 7 years old. Gets a videotape of the kids, sees what their likes and dislikes are, see what their interests are, because these are all kids that were born at the same day in the same hospital. Then he comes back 7 years later, when they're 14, does the same thing. Interviews them, gets footage, blah, 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 blah. He does this every 7 years until they're 56. Yeah. Following their lives, putting together this documentary on them. This is a guy, he started this documentary when he was in his 20s.
How old is he? Like?
He was in his 70s when he finished it. Yeah. He followed these people for 56 years. Every 7 years, going back to see, okay, you all started in the same spot, the same hospital, the same location in England, the same day. What happened? What choices were made? He was a fly on the wall. He didn't manipulate anything. It was a long-term observational study, just to see what happens, to people.
So like
I don't know. It was a documentary. It's called like 7 Up. I think it was called. Yeah, it was on Netflix a few years ago, but they took it off. I didn't watch it, but I always thought it was such an interesting idea.
that isn't.
Yeah. They had a movie similar to that a few years ago where it was like they filmed the movie over the course of 10 years. Yeah, they filmed it like just a couple of weeks during the summer with the same actors. So the kid actors, like you saw them grow up over the course of the movie, but it was the same actor. And then the adults, they were the same adults, but they were growing 10 years older as well. Yeah, it's a long-term idea. So just very quickly, I'm just going to write this down and go to the next page of notes to kind of wrap this up. But retrospective versus prospective. A retrospective study, when you hear the word retro, you're thinking the past, but that's exactly what it is. A retrospective study is something where you are looking at the past in order to do this observation. A prospective study is when you are looking towards what will happen in the future. Yeah. Last little bit of information, and then I can get to the video. An experiment is a manipulation of factors. Remember, an observational study has no manipulation, but an experiment has a manipulation of factors. An experiment has to have random assignment. We've been talking about randomness from day one. It has to have a random assignment. The random assignment that I gave you was I mixed up the slips of paper. And then ultimately, you have to compare results. We'll get into the details of like control groups and placebos and all that stuff next time, of course. But I wanted to get down to the main difference between an experiment and an observational study. An experiment has some manipulation, some level of manipulation. And I know manipulation sounds like a bad thing, but with an experiment, it kind of has to happen. Okay. Let's see what we got here. Now, a couple things before I start this video. First of all, whether you, it doesn't really matter what your opinions are on the man John Oliver. Some people have positive opinions. Some people have negative opinions. That's okay. John Oliver used to work on The Daily Show. He now works for HBO on the show called Last Week Tonight, where he does like 20-minute spiels on some topic in the world today. A lot of the time it is politics. A lot of the time it is just stuff that's been happening, like, you know, whatever. I don't know. John Oliver. He's British. Now, hopefully we can all be adults here. There is some of his humor can be a little bit foul, let's just say. Full warning. The point that I want to make with this video has nothing to do with the foul language that he uses or the inferences that he has, but the topic that he is actually covering, which they use the word scientific studies, but you could replace the word scientific study with observational study or experiment. Please keep that in mind.
Science, the thing we love and respect so much, we only allow scientists to be portrayed by the likes of Arnold Schwarzenegger, Nicolas Cage, and Al Pacino. That is how much we respect them and the complexity of the work they do. Science is constantly producing new studies, as you would know if you've ever watched TV.
A new study shows how sugar might fuel the growth of cancer.
A new study shows late-night snacking could damage the part of your brain that creates and stores memories.
A new study finds pizza is the most addictive food in America.
The new study suggests hugging your dog is bad for your dog.
A new study showing that drinking a glass of red wine is just as good as spending an hour at the gym.
What? That last one? No! That last one doesn't even sound like science. It's more like something your sassy aunt would wear on a t-shirt. And when studies aren't blanketing TV, they're all over your Facebook feed with alerts like study finds liberals are better than conservatives at smizing, your cat might be thinking about killing you, and scientific study shows that bears engage in fellatio. And by the way, I'm not interested. Let me know when bears start engaging in some mutually pleasurable 69ing. Hashtag bear pleasure, hashtag feminism. Time.com once even ran the headline, scientists say smelling farts might prevent cancer, which I would say was the most unfortunate thing Time ever published. But then this is a magazine that once did a cover story on those Asian American whiz kids. The point is, there are now so many studies being thrown around, they can seem to contradict one another. In just the last few months, we've seen studies about coffee that claim it may reverse the effects of liver damage, help prevent colon cancer, decrease the risk of endometrial cancer, and increase the risk of miscarriage. Coffee today is like God in the Old Testament. It will either save you or kill you, depending on how much you believe in its magic powers. And after a certain point, all that ridiculous information can make you wonder, is science bullshit? To which the answer is clearly no, but there is a lot of bullshit currently masquerading as science. So tonight, we thought we'd talk about a few of the reasons why. And first, not all scientific studies are equal. Some may appear in less than legitimate scientific journals, and others may be subtly biased because of scientists feeling pressured to come up with eye-catching positive results.
My success as a scientist depends on me publishing my findings. And I need to publish as frequently as possible in the most prestigious outlets that I can.
Now, that's true. Scientists are under constant pressure to publish with tenure and funding on the line. And to get published, it helps to have results that seem new and striking, because scientists know nobody is publishing a study that says nothing up with acai berries. And to get those results, there are all sorts of ways that...
You know, what's really interesting is that sometimes a scientific study will come out and it will completely change what they're selling in the stores. About 10, 15 years ago, acai berries became this huge deal. And all of a sudden, every drink had to do with acai berries. It was insane. A few years ago, kale was the big thing.
Yeah.
Every couple of years, there's like a superfood that comes out because there's a scientific study saying, hey, this is good now, or something like that. It's really insane.
Consciously or not, you can tweak your study. You could alter how long it lasts, or make your random sample too small to be reliable, or engage in something that scientists call p-hacking. That's p-hacking with a hyphen, not to be confused with facking, which, as I think everyone knows, is a euphemism for f***ing the Philly fanatic. Now, p-hacking is very complicated, but it basically means collecting lots of variables and then playing with your data until you find something that counts as statistically significant, but is probably meaningless. For example, the website 538 surveyed 54 people and collected over 1,000 variables, and through p-hacking the results, was able to find statistically significant correlations between eating cabbage and having an innie belly button, drinking iced tea and believing Crash didn't deserve to win Best Picture, and eating raw tomatoes and Judaism. And the only thing tomatoes have in common with Judaism is that neither of them really feel quite at home in the upper Midwest. But you don't even need to engage in these kinds of manipulations to get results that don't hold up. Even the best designed studies can get flukish results. And the best process that science has to guard against that is the replication study, where other scientists redo your study and see if they get similar results. Unfortunately, that happens way less than it should.
Replication studies are so really funded and they're so underappreciated. They never get published. No one wants to do them. There's no reward system there in place that enables it to happen. So you just have all of these exploratory studies out there that are taken as fact, that this is a scientific fact that's never actually been confirmed.
Exactly. There is no reward for being the second person to discover something in science. There's no Nobel Prize for fact-checking. And incidentally, there's no Nobel Prize for fact-checking is a motivational poster in Brian Williams' MSNBC dressing room. And for all those reasons, scientists themselves know not to attach too much significance to individual studies until they're placed in the much larger context of all the work taking place in that field. But too often, a small study with nuanced tentative findings gets blown out of all proportion when it's presented to us, the lay public. Sometimes that happens when a scientific body puts out a press release summarizing the study for a wider audience. For instance, earlier this year, a medical society hosted a conference at which a paper was presented comparing the effects of high and low flavanol chocolate during pregnancy. If that sounds narrow and technical, it was supposed to be. There wasn't even a control group of women who didn't eat chocolate, and the study found no difference in preeclampsia or high blood pressure between women who ate the two chocolates. So there is no way a study that boring can make it to television, right? Well, wait, because that medical society issued a press release with the much sexier but pretty misleading title, The Benefits of Chocolate During Pregnancy. And because most TV producers just read press releases, this happens.
Turns out if you're pregnant, eating 30 grams a day of chocolate, that's about 2/3 of a chocolate bar, not the whole chocolate bar, could improve blood flow to the placenta and benefit the growth and development of your baby, especially in women at risk for preeclampsia or high blood pressure in pregnancy.
Except that's not what the study said. It's like a game of telephone. The substance gets distorted at every step. And I can only imagine how someone who watched that segment must have described it the next day. Oh, the news said our baby is made of chocolate and it's okay if I eat it, but only 2/3. And it is not like the media needs help blowing things out of proportion. Remember that Time story about farts and cancer? It turns out the study never mentioned either of those things. It just pointed out that certain sulfide compounds are useful pharmacological tools to study mitochondrial dysfunction. And while that Time story was later heavily corrected, the scientists told us that we still get phone calls and emails from strange radio and TV shows wanting us to talk about farts, which is clearly a waste of their time. They're doing valuable work. They shouldn't be wasting their time fielding calls from drive time DJs, Gasman, and The Beef. And there is no doubt some of this is on us, the viewing audience. We like fun, poppy science that we can share like gossip, and TV news producers know it. That is why you constantly hear stuff like this.
Men, listen up. A brand new study says a woman is more open to romance when they are full opposed to being hungry.
Okay. First of all, no shit. Anyone is more open to anything when they aren't hungry. But you should know that study involved only 20 women. And you cannot presume that 20 women can speak for all women. This is science, not the United States Senate. And then there was this eye-catching report from just last year.
A university in England says drinking champagne every week may help delay dementia and Alzheimer's disease. They say only 1 to 3 glasses a week, not a day, a week, could be effective for your health.
Fantastic news. No, it isn't. No, because there's a big issue with that study, aside from the fact that if you are celebrating with champagne 3 times a week, your standards for celebration need to be much higher. Champagne is acceptable on New Year's, Valentine's, birthdays, and if and when Henry Kissinger dies, and that's it. That is it. That is the full list.
Oh.
But the bigger issue...
Henry Kissinger was a former Secretary of State under Richard Nixon. Yeah, it's like a very deep cut political joke.
issue is that study...
People don't like him.
Well, he doesn't like him.
Oh.
Yeah.
was performed on rats. And how do you not tell people that? And how do you not also show them photos of the experiments? Oh. You'd think they would have paired it with some cheese, but it appears they went with cocaine. God, that's chic. Those are chic rats. It's not the drugs that make them cool, it's their confidence. But the truth is, while studies performed on rats and mice are undeniably useful, their applicability to humans can be limited. The overwhelming majority of treatments that work on lab mice do not wind up succeeding in humans, which means 2 things. A, we shouldn't rush out to report rodent results. And B, during lab mouse funerals, when they say, at least he didn't die in vain, most of the time they are lying. I know it hurts to hear that, but them's the breaks, mouse. Now, to be fair, it's not always the news media. Sometimes researchers themselves will oversimplify the science. Even TED Talks, which have had some amazing speakers, have also featured some morning show style science in the past, like Paul Zach's 2011 talk on a hormone produced in the brain called oxytocin, which he even gave a catchy name to.
This little syringe contains the moral molecule. It's so easy to cause people's brains to release oxytocin. I know how to do it. And my favorite way to do it is, in fact, the easiest. Let me show it to you. Come here, give me a hug. There you go. Here's your prescription from Dr. Love. 8 hugs a day. We have found that people who release more oxytocin are happier. And they're happier because they have better relationships of all types. Dr. Love says 8 hugs a day.
First of all, don't call yourself Dr. Love. That's the nickname a tabloid gives a dentist who ejaculated on his sedated patients. And second, there is no way that I would be happier giving 8 hugs a day. I'm English, that is 4 lifetimes worth of hugs. And look, by now, you probably won't be surprised to learn the real science on oxytocin is more complicated than the term moral molecule suggests. Because while it has been found to enhance positive emotions like bonding and trust, researchers have also found that it can enhance negative emotions like envy and bias. So while promising, the science on this is still very much in progress, which probably explains why a recent survey of oxytocin research warned the reports about it influencing a large number of social behaviors should be viewed with healthy skepticism, which is really a long technical way of saying what you probably knew in the first place, which is when a strange man calling himself Dr. Love offers to hug you 8 times a day, say no. And you can see just about all of the problems that I've described, plus one more in a study that made the rounds last year.
The new study claims that driving while dehydrated is just as dangerous as driving drunk. Researchers say drivers who drank just 1 ounce of water per hour made the same number of mistakes on the road as those over the legal limit with alcohol. Doctor, when I heard this, I thought this cannot be true.
Yeah, obviously it couldn't, because it wasn't true. As Britain's National Health Service had already pointed out, that study was riddled with red flags, including that it was based on just 12 men, of whom data was only reported for 11, and it got funding from the European Hydration Institute, a foundation that's received over $7 million from Coca-Cola, a company that just happens to sell rehydration in the form of fizzy brown sugar water, carbonated urine, flat urine, diet urine, and grapefruit-flavoured embalming fluid. And look, just because a study is industry-funded, or its sample size was small, or it was done on mice, doesn't mean it's automatically flawed, but it is something the media reporting on it should probably tell you about. And you may think, well, hold on, where's the harm here? So long as I don't try to fart cancer away or fillet a bear, no one's getting hurt. But I'm not so sure about that. Because think of it this way. This is a chart mapping the results of studies of things like coffee, eggs, and wine. All of them have been linked to raising or lowering your risk of cancer, depending on the study. And everything causes cancer is not the conclusion you want to draw from science. It's the conclusion you should draw from logging onto WebMD, where that is their motto. Because if I were to tell you about each of those studies in isolation, at some point you might reasonably think, well, no one knows anything about what causes cancer. And that is a problem, because that's the sort of thing that enabled tobacco companies for years to insist the science isn't in yet. And if you think I'm exaggerating about the impact that this misreporting can have on our faith in science, look at an example from some of the people most guilty of it. Because the Today Show, which lives for scientific studies, recently concluded one segment like this.
Like a lot of studies that we love around here, there have been a couple, especially related to women, about the benefits, as I get all serious on whole milk. Okay, whole milk, but it's true.
There's a lot of research, though, that says actually having whole milk or having whole fat dairy products actually can help you lose weight.
I think the way to live your life is you find the study that sounds best to you. And you go with that.
No! In science, you don't just get to cherry pick the parts that justify what you were going to do anyway. That's religion. You're thinking of religion. That is what you're thinking of there. And look, this is dangerous. This is really dangerous. If we start thinking that science is a la carte and that if you don't like one study, don't worry, another will be along soon, that is what leads people to think that man-made climate change isn't real or that vaccines cause autism, both of which the scientific consensus is pretty clear on. Science is, by its nature, imperfect, but it is hugely important, and it deserves better than to be twisted out of proportion and turned into morning show gossip. So if they are going to keep saying a study says, they should have to provide sourcing and context or not mention it at all. And I know what you're thinking, well, hold on, if that happens, where am I going to get all my interesting bullshit from? Don't worry, we have you covered.
Do you love science in all its complexity, but wish it could be a little less complex and a lot less scientific? Introducing Todd Talks, where the format of TED Talks meets the intellectual rigor of morning news shows.
Chocolate. It will kill you. What if I were to tell you all that the cure to racism is coffee?
And in my research, I found out red wine makes babies 20% more sociable. That's a baby we can work with.
At Todd Talks, we've raised the bar on entertainment by lowering the bar on what constitutes science.
Our scientists at the Skittles Foundation for Rainbow Tasting have done some pioneering work. We placed 37 volunteers from Tulsa, Oklahoma on an all-Skittle diet for 6 weeks, and guess how many were killed by baboons? 1. 34 people lived. 2 were killed in a non-baboon related murder-suicide.
Why do we do this? Because you love science, but you don't want to hear its process accurately depicted on a stage.
I conducted a randomized, double-blind trial on the effects of coffee on cancer of the esophagus. And while there were statistically significant decreases in incidences of cancer in the mice that were given the coffee compared to the control groups, any definitive conclusions will, of course, have to await human trials, peer review, and replication. Now, of course, this...
I think what he's trying to say is coffee cures cancer. Yes! We did it! We finally did it!
Anyway, it keeps going for a couple more minutes with some funny stuff. But anyway, I'll the link to the video is on the Google Classroom if you want to watch the rest of it. But the bell's going to ring in like 2 seconds. So stay tuned to Google Classroom. I will have another assignment up there for the next part of the project, and we'll go from there. Yeah. Thank you, too.